Good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad to be here at calling from the BCPVA offices, and I'm going to take you on about a 35-minute journey about Indigenous education and really the collective ownership of our responsibilities as educational leaders in the province of BC. And some of you may have watched my Learn to Success video around the three pathways. The focus of the presentation will be a lot around those three pathways. And right now we're just, there you go, technology is working now. Now our slide deck's moving. So just like Kevin was saying, first of all, my ancestral name is Sonamote, and I'm a member of the Squamish Nation. And I'm a district principal in North Van School District. There's my contact information if you want to get a hold of me after this webinar about any questions regarding Indigenous education and support or moving forward or whatnot. Throughout the presentation, you'll see that I'll have many images of my family and of other students and adults within who are very important to my life, because as you will see, learning through imagery is very important to me as an Indigenous person. The two young folks in this photo with me at the beginning here are my two grandsons, Cade and Jet, and they're both students in the Nanaimo School District. A lot of the work that I do today is obviously for them to have a successful career down the road when they go through the school system, no matter where they are. So as we go through this presentation, I want you to think of three questions regarding Indigenous education: is where have we come from, where are we now, and where do we want to go? Because if you look at all three questions, they are very vital for success in the province of BC. Because if we just wanted to answer question three without fully understanding question one or two, we'd really be doing a disservice to the history of this country and the history of this province when it comes to education from K to 12 and across the board. So please remember those questions as we move forward. Also, too, this is going to be talking about my journey within Indigenous education and my role, but also me as an individual, as an Indigenous person, an Indigenous educator, and as a person that is trying to change systemic change within the public school system. So we use this quote from Wab Kinew, and it's very important that we talk about humility with Indigenous education, because all of us are on our own journey. And I'm going to explain to you what I've learned on my journey today, but I also respect where all of you on your learning journey when it comes to Indigenous education and the three pathways that we will talk about. So the first thing I want all of us to understand when we talk about Indigenous education is, if you look at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission 94 calls to action, they all kind of impact all of us in different ways. So as we ask our students to know, do, and understand, we also want to ask us as educational leaders to know, do, and understand. Probably the first thing we want people to do is understand who they are as individuals, what they bring to the education system, what they bring to their individual school, and what they bring to their school district. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about who I am. I'm the son of an Indian residential school survivor. My father went to St. Paul's Indian Residential School in North Vancouver, and this is a photo of the school itself that he attended. And we're not here to talk about his abuses that he endured for the 7 years of the school, but I'm stating that he went to that school because it just lays the foundation of who I am as an individual, but also how I was raised as a child, and how I move forward as an adult, and how it still impacts me today on a daily basis in the world that I live. And this is a young photo of myself to bring identity of the importance of sports, the importance of team athletics to me as an individual. I grew up playing multiple sports in North Vancouver. Soccer, lacrosse are my key sports, and obviously rugby in high school, and moving on to being a coach in rugby after the fact. And I show this image because I was just a regular child, you could say, who enjoyed being part of a broader community. And I didn't really see myself as being a different person as an Indigenous child compared to my neighbors who were not Indigenous. Just shows you as part of the fabric of society. And so while moving into high school, obviously some of you have heard my story about difficulties in high school, where a lot of my first year in grade 8, I was thought as an Italian person when I was embarrassed to admit that I was an Indigenous person. And so part of catching identity or being positive about your own identity is being proud of who you are. So up until grade 8, I was very proud to be a student, very proud to be an Indigenous person. That kind of changed between grade 8 and 9, where I was struggling with my own identity. But after I found my own identity within the public school system at Sutherland Secondary School, I was able to be very successful, which led to the last image I show you here of knowing who I am, where I find myself working with Indigenous role models from across our country to make Canada a better place. And so part of my role is understanding my identity from me as a child or before I was born, what my dad experienced to what I experienced from K to 12 to where I am today, where hopefully I can produce change within our society. Also, too, there are multiple dimensions that are a driving force behind Indigenous education. And these 7 images on this page, these 6 images on this page, are all pulling different strings for me as an individual, for me as a professional. And obviously, for me as a Squamish Nation person, that is the image that stands in the middle. That's the one that controls my heart, controls my mind to move forward in a positive way. But at the same time, I have all these different aspects. The Ministry of Education with our new curriculum, our TRB standards. I'm a current student at UBC in my doctoral program. I have the North Vancouver School District policies that drive my mandate within Indigenous education. I have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission 94 calls to action. Then the top right image that you're looking at is the image of the Governor General's Leadership Council that I was very proudly to be part of in 2017, that was there to try to produce change for Canada in the next 150 years. So all of us as leaders have to know our own identity and be proud of our own identity to bring change into your school, to bring change into your school district. And these are the aspects that I rely on. To move into some very difficult conversations, for so long with Indigenous education, we always had the mirror or the micro focusing on the students themselves without really asking people to look at themselves and self-reflect of where they are. So this is a quote from Michael Marker, and I like reading this to people because I think it's important to also hear the words come into your mind from a different person. Educators who wish to take up the Indigenous challenge must help their students to conceptually focus a mirror rather than a magnifying glass. It's a very telling quote because it's asking people to look at their own self to be able to make effective change. For so long, we wanted the students to change without us as leaders or educators to change. But now we're asking people to be all part of the change process here in the K-12 system. The first pathway that I talk about quite a bit is obviously our students. And the reason why the students are the first pathway, because all of us are in this profession of being an educator, is to improve the life of a student. Our ultimate goal in the K-12 system is to produce good citizens. And so part of producing good citizens now within the North Vancouver School District concept, which can be done across the province and across the country, is having this Indigenous perspective and the Indigenous ways of knowing for the students. And I think the most important part of knowing our students is understand the Indigenous voice is just as valuable as the non-Indigenous voice. We talk about equity in the province of BC and equitable opportunity, the equitable voice, but how do we manage that? How do we allow the Indigenous voice to be part of our fabric? And so that is through various forums where we get to know the students and be able to practice the Indigenous ways of knowing part of everyday classrooms, everyday leadership. Just to continue on the theme of the first pathway of knowing our students, if you look at these 2 images here, there's no Indigenous students in these pictures because Indigenous education is for all students. And for so long, including my own K-12 career here in British Columbia, it was a continuous pull-out system for Indigenous students. They were thought of as not as good, if you want to say that, as non-Indigenous students. But here you can see that if we're practicing the Indigenous perspective by using circles, by bringing in guest speakers around the Indigenous perspective, it's good for all. So if you look at the First Peoples principles of learning, the 9 principles, they're very vital to the overall success for all learners. And the way the Ministry of Education and Finesse developed those not too long ago for English First Peoples 12, it shows that the simple use of those principles in our classrooms will benefit all learners, which in the end will allow the Indigenous voice and the Indigenous student to be successful. Ultimately, we want all of our students to learn the Indigenous perspective, which includes the Indigenous voice. So it's very important for the first pathway. And we talk about leadership with our Indigenous students. These last two images for students I'm showing are around the strength and the power of student leadership. And all of these students are Indigenous. So I went from non-Indigenous Indigenous students to Indigenous students, but it shows you that the picture on the left is our student leadership group from North Vancouver, and they're meeting with our superintendent to hopefully help them develop procedures, policies, guidelines of implementing Indigenous knowledge at the board level, at the trustee level. Because ultimately the Western way of politics, we want to call that, does not include the Indigenous voice. So we have the Indigenous student voice to help guide that. Then obviously the right image is our cultural practices of the Indigenous people become a part of school life, the school culture. And it was not too long ago in North Vancouver and probably in other districts across the province where it was looked upon not to include Indigenous culture within everyday life of schools through assemblies, through the singing of the Coast Salish anthem, through the dance performances. That's all part of our Indigenous student growth of leaderships within their schools and within the school district. So this is a graph that was created in 2015, Leadership Through an Indigenous Worldview. It was created by the original cohort of the BCPBPA Indigenous Education Committee. And this is one thing that we looked at when we looked at the standards that were current in use then. We wanted to indigenize the standards. And this was the title page that was created by the group at the time around the use of the medicine wheel. And obviously the four spheres of the medicine wheel are being translated into the standards that we use in the BC Principals and Vice Principals Association. But if you look at it all we're trying to use this medicine wheel is for all of us to be a balanced leader. If you look at the terms that we use around the body, spiritual, emotional, intellectual, those are all aspects that all of us as leaders use on a daily basis to be positive role models for our students and for our fellow educators. So this is why we talk about our second pathway of educators. Because ultimately, our educators have to be educated on what they're doing. And so on how they include the Indigenous perspective. But they have to be able to ground themselves within the Indigenous worldview. And there's a lot of questions that we get on a continuous basis is what is an Indigenous worldview? And so part of us and our growth of educators and us as leaders is to gain a stronger attention to what the Indigenous worldview is. And we have to remember in the province of British Columbia, with the vast size of our province, but also the multiple distinct areas of Indigenous peoples. So my Indigenous worldview from Coast Salish Squamish Nation perspective will be completely different than my cousins who are up in Haida Gwaii or my cousins who live up in Fort St. John and Hudson Hope area. So that's very important when we talk about leadership through an Indigenous worldview is that it's place-based. So where you happen to be an educational leader at is to ensure that you understand the local First Nations history, understand the local First Nations Indigenous worldview, because it's very important that you understand that because that's who you have to work with in the end too. So please remember these four spheres as we move forward. So if you look at, we talked about the First Peoples Principle learning for students. And if you look at this quote around Indigenous leadership, the key terms in here are people, place, past, and present. So if you look at those four aspects, I talked about the role that we have of knowing our place, where we are in the province. But not only that of knowing place, it's also those personal relationships with other people from the Indigenous community and the non-Indigenous community. And what that will do by creating positive relationships as educational leaders will help us understand the past, but also how we can hopefully move forward from the present situation we stand in within our province, but also within your school district. And so that is true leadership through an Indigenous lens as we talk about it moving forward, because ultimately, uh, we're not asking anyone to completely change their practice, but just include the Indigenous leadership for aspects there. Can continue on the theme of educating the educators. One thing that we do that we would like that all school districts do at some level is educating the educator. And so what we recommend from our perspective in North Vancouver is our educators go on the land. And so this is an image of a beginning of the year grounding ceremony, as we called it, that was provided to us by the Squamish Nation. And this was done at sunrise at the Chief Joe Mathias Center on the Capilano Murchison Indian Reserve. And the cultural leaders, the knowledge keepers from the Squamish Nation provided these individuals a grounding ceremony to cleanse them, to cleanse their spirituality before they started the school year. And it's very important when we talk about spirituality as an educator, as a leader. Spirituality to Indigenous people is not religion. Spirituality is something that embodies us to move forward, but also embody us to understand the past, understand the present, to understand the future. So it's very important that we recognize the spirituality around us as educators learning the Indigenous worldview. So we continue on some of the policies that are guiding us in the province of BC. We all recall the 2015 Auditor General's report and the three key aspects or the themes that came out of that. And obviously the most telling one for all of us as leaders was the racism of low expectations. And so this report was created due to the lagging achievement rate in the province for Indigenous students on and off reserve. And so the Auditor General challenged the Ministry of Education, Indigenous Education Learning Branch to change their methods. And these are the three things that I stated that were used in 2015 as the structure for us to move forward. So I talked about the racism of low expectations, the coherent structures, and this is within school districts of policy making from the Board of Trustees down to our educational leaders of what structure we put in place to support Indigenous education. Then obviously the last one is the lack of involvement with our local Indigenous communities. And that is from 2015 where we stand today with the BC Tripartite Education Agreement, where there has to be active involvement. So that's one positive that came out of the 15 Auditor General's report. In June of 2019, the Auditor General of BC issued a new release looking at the recommendations we were made from 2015, and we still have not made all the obligations from 2015. So it's still a work in progress for all of us in the province of BC. Oh. So continue on the provincial mandate, what we believe in, obviously with the new curriculum or revised curriculum or whatever you want to call it, there are four categories. One is the worldview, one is content, one is resources, obviously one is the principles of learning that I've talked about in the past. And we're very cautious about how we talk about these because when the new curriculum first rolled out, there was a huge push, just give teachers just wanted resources. And as an Indigenous education team in North Van, we took a step back and asked people, let's understand the worldview first. Let's understand why we have Indigenous perspective part of our practice now. Let's look at the principles of learning. And then that will help drive the content, which will eventually drive the resources. And so, because resources, as we all know, are not the entire picture when teaching the curriculum. Part of what we ask educators to do is to make sure when they're teaching and using the resources that they bring a personal story to it. And that is part of the Indigenous worldview, is bringing that to their practice. So all four of these categories must be working together for us to be successful in BC. Some of you might have seen this graph before, and it's when the new curriculum was first came out, um, us in North Vancouver had a self-reflection rubric, and it was decided that out of that self-reflection rubric, there are basically 6 categories that educators fell upon and around indigenizing their practice or indigenize themselves as educators. And obviously, we want all of us in British Columbia to be Indigenous centric, but we also know this is a long journey that we're on. And you heard me talk about that in our video, the series, where it was 150 years of policies of oppression to get to where we want to change society. It's going to take 150 years or 7 generations to correct itself. And so, unfortunately, we still have some educators in the hostile or lack of interest spheres around Indigenous education. We have a lot of individuals that show a lot of interest, want to make a change, but they're unsure how to do it, and they're afraid to make a mistake. And then we have a group of individuals who we call allies, who are Indigenous centric and knowledgeable application. I think it's very important when you talk about allies too. Uh, as an Indigenous educator, it's very important that you understand as a non-Indigenous person, you cannot name yourself an ally. And the term ally must be gifted to you from an Indigenous person. And I think there are many of us who are Indigenous leadership, we're very cautious about that, because when we're using the term ally, it must be used appropriately. Because a term ally, if we give someone the term ally, that means they're Indigenous centric, but also they value us as Indigenous people. Because part of being an ally, none of us as Indigenous people want to be saved. All of us want to be treated equitable within the educational leadership world. So that's part of what being an ally is being knowledgeable. So here are some recent examples of, we talk about that hostility or lack of interest part around our province of BC. And we do an exercise at what's called the truth wall to talk about difficult subjects, difficult topics when it talks about Indigenous education or about personal feelings to an individual. And as you can see from these post-it notes, there's no names on them. We provide a brave space for people to talk about their biases or their knowledge of Indigenous peoples. We don't really use the word safe space. It's the brave space for them to talk about it, because we talk about racism within our schools. There are still some situations or some individuals that that lean towards racism towards Indigenous peoples. And so, how do we get over that? So, part of that getting over that is to have exercises like this where people are allowed to put their thoughts down on paper, and have other people have a gallery walk to see what is going on. But that leads to a discussion where, how do we change people's perception? And that's the biggest thing with Indigenous education. If people are still on that scale of hostility or lack of interest, how do we change their opinion to where they see the value of Indigenous education? And I think that's where educating the educator comes into play. And so, if you look at the history and hope, um, you know, the Indigenous pedagogy is so important for us to move forward. You look at these 5 themes here. I mean, all of it is factual stuff that we all need to know, that ceremony is very important to us, Indigenous people. We all must decolonize. We must have a colonial relationship where we're able to get along. Then obviously I talked about the conceptions and misconceptions of us moving forward. Because you look at the journey that we're on in BC and what the BC Principals and Vice Principals Association do, there's hope for all of us. And I think the big thing around the word hope is that everything's possible. And you look at Paulette Regan around the personal to the political. Paulette Regan's book, Unsettling the Settler Within, is a very prominent book that we share with educational leaders, because it provokes them to think about their own feelings and provokes them how to move forward around Indigenous education. And I think the common theme within this quote is that all of us today on October 22nd, 2019, are impacted by residential schools because we live in Canada. And that's a hard thing for people to recognize or understand, but we have to know that's part of our fabric. no one is blaming or making everybody feel guilty about that. But part of why we need to understand is because all of the attributes or the impacts from residential schools that we face in our school system around conceptions, biases, racism or low expectations, but also some of the success stories that we have around student achievement is all due to the residential schools, and we have to understand that. So when we talk about decolonization, that's a big word that people use. Some people don't like, but I think the big thing about it is it's around challenge and privilege. Um, and I think we live with us living in the Western society and in British Columbia, there are certain people that receive more privilege than other people. And that's something we have to admit that it does happen in the province of BC. And how do we challenge that? And so I think the big thing is building trust. And trust is so important, and respectful relationships. Because if we have trust and respect with individuals, it will lead to positive relationships for us to move forward. And that's very important because ultimately we're all in this together to move forward, as I said in my video. And so part of it is challenge and privilege to repair relationships. Just look around this quote around pedagogy again. That's the same, sorry, that's a double slide. My technology is not working. There it is, sorry. The next slide is around the settler denial and identity crisis. So if you look at where we were, I was talking about privilege, it's around institutions. So if you look at our Western education system that we all work in here in BC, how do we include that Indigenous perspective within that Western institution? So part of it is moving away from ignorance, because for so long, people use the term, I did not know, I know. We can no longer do that as educators because there's been so much work and so much action done in the last 6 to 8 years in the province. The work of the TF, the work of the Ministry of Education, the work of the principals, vice principals, and the TRC Commission, where part of societal change comes from the education system. So us as leaders have to understand that we're responsible for change. So we talk about Western dominance. I talked a little bit about that around the dominance, the Western educational system, but also the legal processes. So how do we change policy? Because we don't want to reinforce the status quo. Because if we stay in the mandate of what we're doing now, we're not really doing what's best for Indigenous students, which in turn is not best for all Indigenous learners. So part of that is moving away from the colonial form of empathy. And you heard me earlier talk about as Indigenous people, we don't want to be saved. We want our students to go to school to be educated with the Indigenous perspective part of their practice. And that's one thing we have to remove the colonial form of empathy. And this talks a little bit more about the colonial form of empathy, about educating the educator. And it allows, all of us in the education have to gain a stronger understanding of our history, but also our moral responsibility to make a change. Because ultimately, the information that our system provides and Indigenous people provide, we ask all of you to take that and use that. Because as an educator, we want you to take risks. We ask students to take risks every day in the classroom. We're asking educators to take risks, especially leaders, on a daily basis to change the mentality within our school structure. So we talk about hope. So obviously the work that we're doing in BC for the last 4 or 5 years around Indigenous education is very emotional for Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. We talk about sometimes how we make people feel uncomfortable or provoke people as Indigenous people. But I think one thing that we have to remember is that us Indigenous folks too, who are doing this work, it's very hard on us too, because part of repairing or coping with the relationship is we give individuals a piece of ourselves every time we tell a story. And that's where trust comes in. And that's where Indigenous pedagogy becomes part of the norm. So if we have a handout, we want a hand brought back to us. And we want to look eye to eye as we move forward with Indigenous education. So we talk about the change process. This is going to be an ongoing process. It's not an event, because If we were going to race to change, it would not work very well for everyone. So part of it is we have to make sure we ensure that we take this a slow process, because it's not a race to the end. It's more of us moving forward together in a very productive way. Just to wrap up in the next 5 or 6 minutes, I'm gonna give you some examples that you could use within your own school district around the change process, especially educating the educator. I know many of you out there already have dinner and dialogues where you bring people in at nighttime, feed them food. Food's always popular, especially in the Indigenous way of knowing. And you provide the space for people to have dialogue and ask questions. Ask them how they're doing within their structures of their school. But we also offer some formal workshops of professional development for teachers and principals and vice principals, to where we provide them concrete examples of what they can be doing in their practice. Then obviously the last two around inquiry and dialogue, book clubs, we show movies. So we provide multiple learning opportunities that are all volunteer, most of them, where people can come after hours to sit with us as Indigenous leaders or the Indigenous Ed team and how they can move forward. So if you look at the House Post of District and School Plan, I know all of us are going through our school planning process right now that's very complex, but how do you include the Indigenous voice within that structure? And here we go, using the medicine wheel again as an ongoing shift to change our practice. And ultimately, we talked about board governance. You heard me talk about the Board of Trustees being involved in the change process. It's very important to have your trustees aware of Indigenous education and provide them teachings where it becomes part of their policy structure to make it better for all learners through the Indigenous perspective. Then obviously the district vision through you as a district team or a superintendent to our vibrant learning communities. And so just to end with some quotes, I know I'm running out of time here. So Justice Murray Sinclair, who was the main author of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, you talk about our destination. The road we travel is equal in importance to the destination we seek. There are no shortcuts. When it comes to truth and reconciliation, we're all forced to go to the distance. And you notice throughout the presentation, I read some quotes, and I don't read some quotes, because I think some quotes need to be heard rather than just read. Because it's very important through the oral tradition we have as Indigenous people, that part of the learning process is to hear somebody else speak. And that's Murray Sinclair is one of the most powerful speakers we have in this country when it comes to truth and reconciliation. So very important points: respect, reflection, relevant, reciprocal. So if you look at those 4 R's from Verna Kirkness's work at UBC, and patience and time, and how this is a long journey. And the pathway to success is going to be through multiple angles, multiple switchbacks, or whatever you want to call it, for all Indigenous students, but also for all learners in our province when it comes to Indigenous Ed. So I asked you 3 questions to start. Where are we? Where have we come from? Where do we want to go? But also 2 questions you should look at for yourself. What are the next steps for your own professional growth? And then how will this transpose to supporting the community education students in your school or your school district? So 2 questions that you can always look at yourself on a daily basis where you are. Great quote from Kevin Lamoureux: by leaving today and not doing anything or changing, that is a choice you have made. So the information we're providing you, or BCPVA have done through multiple learning opportunities, you have lots of information now. What do you do with it? And the work that we do is for a young child like this in the image. We don't know if it's a boy or a girl. It's an Indigenous student wearing their hair long, traditionally, holding an eagle feather for respect and courage, but also wearing a shawl to protect their heart. So it's the heart and mind that drive us to where we are today. And I started the presentation with a photo of my 2 grandkids. And so I end with my 2 grandkids because I didn't tell you at the beginning, they're Indigenous. So I am fortunate enough where I have a stepdaughter who is with a gentleman from Newfoundland who is First Nations. So I don't have my own kids because I wanted to break the cycle of violence through residential schools. I talk about my dad. My dad loved us. He was hard on us. He didn't abuse us, but he was just hard on us. So I didn't want to have my own kids so I can break that cycle. But I'm fortunate enough that I have two grandsons through my stepdaughter who are Indigenous. So all we ask educators to do, all I know that they will have is their education experience will be better than mine because mine was better than my dad's. So that's that generational change that we ask people to do. And as we say, it's going to take forward. So please, all of you, go forward with courage. Wojtka, thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Brad. I've had the great pleasure of listening to a number of Brad's presentations, and I absolutely learn something new every time I listen to Brad. And so we do have some time for questions. There's a question box there available to you if you'd like to ask Brad any questions. Please just type in your question quickly, and Brad will do his best to answer them and get to as many as we can. Before we start, I have a couple of questions for Brad. So Brad, you have had this remarkable experience in terms of on a national level, really supporting Indigenous students and Indigenous student success. I'm curious from your perspective, is there another province that we can learn from in terms of supporting Indigenous learner success? Are they doing something out there that we should be doing in BC? And if that is the case, what would you suggest as next steps for us?
I think in the big picture, British Columbia is ahead of the game compared to the rest of the country in a lot of aspects. But I think there's one aspect. You look at the work that's being done in Saskatchewan around supporting their on-reserve Indigenous students. And I think that's one thing that they do quite well at, where they provide the extra supports, the extra services for those students to ensure that they're successful at school. I mean, I think what we're doing in British Columbia around the curriculum is ahead of the curve, and so I think that's part of what is awesome. So people are coming to us to learn from us, but at the same time, we can't be resting on our laurels as a province. We got to continue to move forward and learn from others. So if we can take something from different aspects across this country, we should do that.
So we often look at Indigenous grad rates as one indicator to tell us how our Indigenous students are doing. And of course, we've seen some successes, but we have a very long way to go. Are there other provincial indicators that you think are as good or better than grad rates that we should be really looking at to see how Indigenous kids provincially are doing?
I think I think it's important for us in individual schools, individual school districts, is to have the opportunity of the story to be told of what they're doing for Indigenous education and for Indigenous learners. Because I think the success that we're showing in grad rates, which is still can be better, but I think it's the story of the students that have improved significantly in attendance, their sense of belonging, their use of their cultural practices within their school day. That can be seen as success. Because in the end, if we rely on data, only data or stats, it will not show the full picture.
Okay. And good with that, we're getting close to the end of our time together, so I'm going to bring this to a close. As I mentioned at the beginning, I always learn something more from Brad's presentations. He did have his contact information at the beginning of the presentation, so if you want to reach out to Brad directly, please feel free to do so. Let's see if we got a couple of things in the chat box. Sorry. Oh, just some comments from panelists and of course from Tammy. Thank you for leading the way, Brad. And I think that's a wonderful way for us to close the presentation. We look to Brad as a provincial leader to really support Indigenous learners, but also to support us as non-Indigenous, those of us who are non-Indigenous school leaders, really benefit from Brad's advice and guidance. And so one last promo before we leave. Tomorrow we have a similar webinar with Faye Brownlee on literacy education. Hopefully you can join us with that. My thanks to Brad for a very powerful webinar today, and thank you to everyone for participating.